The session today is on princes and patronage. And because we're dealing with princes and punctuality is the prerogative of princes, we'll start on time at 10 o'clock. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome and thank you for being here prompt and early on a Saturday morning. Before I formally introduce our distinguished panel, I'd just like to say a couple of words of thanks. And the first is to Razi and his team. They've been The second is to honor an absent friend and mentor, and that is Iqbal Zaid Ahmed. He's the hidden support beneath the LLF. Bali, wherever you are, we are with you. And just as wherever you are, you're with us here today. The LLF is the greatest aggregation of intellect in Lahore, and it bears out the accolade that has been granted of making us, Lahore, the UNESCO City of Literature. This morning, we have three profound minds here to discuss patrons, whether imperials like the local rulers in India, or imported imperialists, and the outcome, visual outcome of their patronage. Let me introduce our three panelists. Audrey Truschke is a historian, author, and activist. Hang on, she's more. She's assistant professor of South Asian history at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. She's the author of two award-winning books, Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at the Mughal Court, and Aurangzeb. And she spoke about her book Aurangzeb in LLF 2018. She's a specialist in Hindu-Muslim interaction, and therefore she's the one person that PM Modi should call for advice, and hasn't.
Waiting for the call.
Mehreen, Dr. Mehreen, Chida-Razvi, is an art historian specializing in the art and architecture of Mughal South Asia. She regularly teaches courses and lectures on Islamic and Indo-Islamic art at universities and museums in London and Oxford. And a selection of her other publications germane to Lahore are Patronage and Power, Power in Appropriation, Constructing Jahangir's Mausoleum, A Sultan Before the Padshah, questioning the identity of the turban figure in that famous painting of Jahangir, preferring a sheikh, Sufi sheikh, to kings. And where is the greatest city in the East? Well, no marks for guessing. It's the Mughal city of Lahore, in European accounts between 1556 and 1648. William Dalrymple, the rose between two chrysanthemums, is the sort of brilliant author who forces mediocre writers like us to swallow our pens with cyanide. His first book, In Xanadu, came out in 1989, and he's written 10 others since. His latest runaway success is The Anarchy, the relentless rise of the East India Company, which came out last year. After its publication, somebody, and I suspect it's you, tweeted a picture of our Prime Minister in salwar kameez reading...
It wasn't me, no.
reading The Anarchy on a plane journey on his way back from New York. I'm told on good authority that our Prime Minister thought it was about modern Pakistan. So let's begin the session, and I'm going to invite Audrey, please, if you could.
Thank you very much, Aijazuddin, for that kind introduction for all of us. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about the translation of Sanskrit text into Persian, particularly in Akbar's court. Very good. So Akbar begins ruling in 1556, in earnest in 1560, after his regency with Bayram Khan ends. And pretty quickly, the Mughals start to try to figure out what it means to be Indian kings. They know what it means to be Timurid rulers. They know what it means to be descended from the Mongols. But what does it mean to rule India, right? That was less clear to them. And part of the project of figuring that out involved translating around a dozen Sanskrit texts into Persian. In that series of projects that spanned several decades, the sort of two pinnacles were the two Hindu epics, the two great Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. These were the two pinnacles in part because they simply took the most resources. Both texts took several years to translate. They took a number of people, both had teams of translators involved, and they were incredibly expensive. Now, if you've never read these two texts, I encourage you to go out after this session and find a copy of both and read them. But for now, what you really need to know is that they're about kingship, okay? The images for both the Mahabharata, renamed the Razamnama or Razamname in Persian, and the Ramayana are fantastic, and I love the images. But I must confess that I am a very textually focused historian, and so I do want to remind you that while the images are glorious, the majority of these translations are actually text. Uh-oh. What happened? No. Is there a way to go back? Okay, I guess it just takes time. Sorry, guys. Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you about these translations is how they were done. Nobody involved in the translation process knew both Sanskrit and Persian. So nobody knew both the source language of the epics and the target language into which they were being translated. So what they did is they had two teams of translators, and you can see this in the image here. On the bottom, you have the Brahmins, who know Sanskrit. On the top here, you have the Mughals, who know Persian. The Brahmins read the Sanskrit text. They verbally translated it into Hindi, the shared language between the two groups. The Mughals heard it in Hindi and then wrote it down in Persian. And you can actually see some specificity in this image. If you'll notice near the Brahmins, you have horizontal, unbound manuscripts. That's how Sanskrit manuscripts typically appear. Whereas near the Mughals, you have more vertical, bound Persian books. Again, an accurate sort of image. Now, once the texts were translated, a sort of master imperial copy was produced for each one, for both the Razamnama, the Mahabharata, and for the Ramayana. We are very lucky in that the master imperial copies made for Emperor Akbar himself both survive today, okay? And they're lavishly illustrated. They look really gorgeous, but I've never seen them, okay? And that's because while we're lucky that they survive, we are a bit unlucky in that they survive in the Jaipur Royal Collection, where they have been under lock and key for about 40 years now as part of a court dispute among the former royal family. Now, this actually matters, in my opinion, slightly more for the Ramayana. That's because the Persian Mahabharata, once it's translated, the text is stable. Okay, the text appears to be the same from manuscript to manuscript, and that doesn't change until about 100 years later, and that is a different story. But for the Ramayana, this is not the case. We do have access to the second and third oldest copies of this translation. They are held in Doha, Qatar, and in Washington, D.C., respectively. And those two manuscripts differ from one another, not just in the images where you would expect difference, but in the text itself. And without access to the Jaipur Royal copy, I cannot tell you who is changing what. Okay, so our ability to work on the Persian Ramayana from Akbar's period is pretty severely hampered right now. One thing that we do have access to that I thought I would share with you is the Harivamsa. Okay, this is the appendix to the Mahabharata that had long become sort of integral to the epic itself. The Mughal court translates it along with the rest of the epic, and we have this fantastic copy that is held in the Lucknow State Museum in northern India today. This copy was certainly owned by Akbar's court. It's a little bit less clear to me if it was part of the master imperial copy or not, but you can see how lavish it is, right? There's burnished gold between every line of text. Now, it's not that unusual to have burnished gold between the lines of text on the first folio of the manuscript. It's a little bit rarer to have it on the second folio of the manuscript, but I've never seen it before on every single folio of a several hundred-page manuscript, and that is the case here. My only complaint is that the burnished gold confused my camera, and you can see some of that in the photographing here, so my pictures are not as clear as I would like. Now, after the epic is translated, I thought I'd just point out a couple of features of both of these texts. So as I said, they're about Indian kingship. Indian kings of various religious backgrounds had been patronizing these epics for hundreds of years before the Mughals show up, okay? And that's because when you patronized a new version of the epic, you could sort of have it reflect your kingship, right? Whoever the particular emperor was, the particular ruler. And Akbar did likewise, but it seems to have a different valence when he does it. So take, for example, these illustrations. Here on your left, you have the court of Emperor Akbar, right, from a contemporary illustration from his period. Then in the middle, you have the court of Yudhishthira from the Razamnama, and then at the far end, the court of Rama from the Ramayana. Except that it seems to me that we're in Akbar's court in all three images, right? Complete with a sort of Akbar-looking king sitting on the throne, a sort of Mughal-like throne, Persian carpets, the red sandstone, and everything, all right? And that was sort of part of the point for Akbar, is that these epics could almost predict his kingship coming to India. I love this detail on the middle image. Can you see this guy in sort of orange-red with the black turban, right? I think that this is a European visitor, circa late 16th century. There were no European visitors of this sort to Yudhishthira's court in ancient India, but there certainly were to Akbar's court in early modern South Asia. Another aspect of these epics that's worth noting is the sort of crowded divine landscape. So both of the Hindu epics are chock full of various gods, right? Lots of different deities. And these are by and large preserved in the Persian translations. So here you can see on your left, you can see Vishnu and Garuda, okay? And here you see Lord Vishnu sort of depicted in a very humanoid fashion, okay, on Garuda. And then on your right, you can see the gods and the asuras, right? The suras and the asuras, the gods and the demons churning the milk ocean. Okay, right, sort of with the Mount Mandara resting on the tortoise here. Now, while the Mughals maintained Hindu gods when they translated the epics, they also added one important god to them, namely Khoda. And they do usually call it Khoda rather than Allah in the text. So I want to be clear that Khoda does not replace the Hindu gods. He's sort of this overlay on top of them. And this is a theology that's never really worked out. And that's because I don't think it's really theological. I think it was really a sort of practical translation strategy to make the epics comprehensible to a majority Muslim audience. And I'll give you just one example of how the two are sort of meshed together. These are scenes from the Ramayana where Lord Rama is picking up the bow of Shiva, and he breaks the bow and thereby proves that he is awesome and supposed to marry Sita, and the story goes on. Except that in the Mughal version, he picks up Shiva's bow, right, Shiva being a Hindu god, and then he strings it and breaks it in the name of Khoda, right? So again, this sort of overlay. So I hope that gives you all a little sense of the translations that the Mughals did of Sanskrit text into Persian, and sort of what's your appetite for some of the crucial roles that they played in the articulation of Mughal Indian kingship.
Thank you very much indeed, Audrey. I hope you could see the slides. We weren't coming in the way? Okay. You couldn't? Well, we'll move to one side. Thank you very much indeed. Audrey has touched upon a very important but often forgotten attribute to the Mughals, which was their open-mindedness, and particularly of Akbar. And I'm reminded of a visit that was made by Sudha Narayanamurthy. She was the wife, or is the wife, of Mr. Narayanamurthy, and she was the co-founder of Infosys, which is one of the largest IT companies in India. She came to Lahore, and I was asked to look after her, and I said, "Where would you like to go?" And she said, "To Jahangir's tomb." I said, "Why to Jahangir's tomb? Other places you might be interested in visiting." She said, "No, I want to go there because he is the first secular Mughal emperor, because he had a Muslim father and a Hindu mother." And I was very touched at that, and this, in a sense, has been brought out by your presentation of the marriage between Mughal patronage and the sacred texts, such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, etc. Now, I'll invite Mehreen. Could you please take this podium?
Thank you, Ajasab. And thank you all for being here. And I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you a little bit about Mughal art and aesthetics as well. And what I want to do is, because it's such a large topic, I've drawn out one particular aspect, which is the aspect of portraiture, which really comes to define Mughal painting. And I want to talk about it specifically in how portraiture was used to convey power, imperial power, and the power of the Mughal rule in this region. And I'm starting with this slide because this shows you the key importance of patronage when it comes to how Mughal style developed. If you look at the painting on the right-hand side compared to the painting on the left-hand side, you are looking at generic images on the right. In the center, there's a generic image of the great ruler Timur, a generic image of Babur, a generic image of Humayun. But when you look on the left-hand side, you are seeing proper portraits of Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan. And this is because when Mughal painting emerges as its own individual style, it comes about because it's an amalgamation of Persian painting, Rajasthani painting, Jain painting, and European elements of technique and style. And this really sets the stage for what becomes Mughal painting, and it distinguishes it from any other style of painting occurring at that time. And the reason we get this shift from this kind of generic imagery of, just Mongol faces or Timurid faces to actual portraits of individuals is because of the interest in portraying the real world and the natural world, which starts under Akbar and then really continues under the reign of Jahangir, who has this obsession with portraying real life around him. And so the idea of portraying the reality of life, the reality of the court, the reality of images, he really pushes that in his artists. And so he's key, and Akbar is key in the transformation of the Mughal style of painting. And so this is one example where if you look at these side by side, you can really see that. And I want to stress, if you look at the dates of these two paintings, these are done during Shah Jahan's reign in the 1630s. And it's because we have the artists copying former images of Timur, Babur, and Humayun that we still have this generic imagery. It's the costume which defines who they are. Whereas on the left-hand side, we have actual portraits of Akbar from his reign, portraits of Jahangir from his reign, and portraits of Shah Jahan being produced. So these are the images which are being looked at and then relayed into the imperial Mughal manuscripts and albums. And another way of showing this shift in style very starkly is in this detail from a painting that's in the British Museum called Princes of the House of Timur. And if you look in the central pavilion, on the right-hand side, the figure wearing that kind of pointed turban is Humayun. And it was during his reign that this painting was actually produced. And during that time, it was Persian artists who were working for him. So the original painting is full of Persian images. And if you look at the figures behind Humayun on the right-hand side, also wearing the pointed caps, you can see again very generic features on the faces. Later, during the reign of Jahangir, and then later during the reign of Shah Jahan, the painting was repainted in certain areas to place Akbar, Jahangir, and Prince Khurram in front of Humayun, and to paint in different members of their court. So you can look at a painting like this, a single painting, and really see where and how the style of painting, in particular portraiture, shifts during the Mughal period. And this is just to show you how rare this was. And remember, this was pushed by the desires of the rulers in wanting to portray the reality of life as they found it. And so the painting on the left-hand side is a detail of Jahangir in Darbar. You can see that we have this proper portrait of him reflecting that mixed heritage of being both Timurid and being Rajput. And then you can see in front of him courtiers, his sons in front of him. Each person is individualized, each person is unique, and it's because the artists are making actual portraits of these individuals. And if you compare this with contemporary painting from the Ottoman period and the Ottoman court and the Safavid court, who are the contemporary great Muslim courts at this point in time, you can really see this differentiation and how unique Mughal painting is, and it's because of this depiction of reality. And it's one of the things which defines the Mughal aesthetic and differentiates it. So on the upper right-hand side, you have a painting of Sultan Murat, the fourth of the Ottoman court. You can see that it's a very round face, but there's no shading, there's no idea of modeling to make it look like an actual face. It's very flat. And on the bottom right-hand side, it's a detail of Shah Abbas and a page in front of him. Now, on Shah Abbas's face, he's the figure on the left. You can see some shading, he has a shadow of beard. His eyes, there's a little bit of modeling around it to give the idea of three-dimensional, space on the face. But if you look at the page, it's a moon face. It's this very round face. There's no shading. Again, it's a generic face, which you'll find many other figures in the court represented in that particular fashion. So especially when you look at the Safavid and Ottoman painting in comparison to Mughal painting side by side, it's very, very clear that the aesthetic of Mughal painting is extremely particular, extremely fine, and I know I'm biased, but I think is some of the most just amazingly beautiful and real painting being produced at this period. And one of the other things which defines this Mughal painting, and in particular the aspect which I'm talking about, this idea of portraiture used to represent power and political power, because I would say that it's during Jahangir's reign, you have this visual language which is developed and projected in paintings, which is all about presenting the power of the Mughal ruler and the power of the Mughal court. And this is done through different symbolic ways. So one of the things which I hope jumps out at you in this particular painting is the fact that around Jahangir's head and Akbar's head in the portrait he's holding are halos. And so the idea of the halo, the visualization of the halo, is taken from Christian imagery, which is at the Mughal court, but it's taken and adapted in these instances. We have these halos signifying the divine right of the Mughals to rule their empire. It's not signifying that they are divine themselves, but that they've been given this God-given right. And it reflects this ancient Iranian notion of kingship, where divine light emanates from the ruler to show that they alone have this authority and this power given to them to rule over their empire. And so we have this incredible visualization, which starts in Mughal painting during the reign of Jahangir, is retroactively applied to his predecessors. So we have the portraits of Akbar, Humayun, Babur, going back to Timur, from Jahangir's period onward, represented with the halo also. But from the early part of the 17th century, it becomes a ubiquitous part of Mughal painting. And it's again because of the patron. It's because Jahangir wants these types of images, wants this type of iconography used in the court scenes. Because one of the things we find in Mughal manuscripts are these incredible images of the court. And so, for example, so we can say the portraiture of space. And so in these paintings, we see the actual representations of the audience halls that these scenes were taking place in. But you see Prince Khurram, who's the future Shah Jahan, on the upper right-hand side, being handed a turban ornament by Jahangir, and the turban ornament is a sign of rulership. And so there's this symbolic handing over of the crown, eventually, to Shah Jahan, which is being represented. But if you look at all the figures around them, each and every one of them is different, because each and every one of them is a portrait of the actual courtier who is being represented. And if you look at these paintings closely, this is in the Windsor Padshahnameh, this incredible illustrated history of Shah Jahan's reign, which is now in the Royal Collection in Windsor. But if you look at this closely at the actual painting, on each of the figures is a tiny label in Persian telling us who that person is. And so we know who the courtier is. We can find other portraits of that courtier as well. And so we know these are proper portraits which have been done by these particular, by the artists of Shah Jahan's court and also earlier. So just a brief delving into of Mughal painting, particularly of Jahangir and Shah Jahan's reign, to highlight this incredible aesthetic which is produced at the Mughal court, which relies entirely on the desires of the patrons and their need to project imperial power, their desire to project imperial power, and how incredibly important portraiture plays in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mehreen. You've emphasized both the role of the patrons, imperials as they were, and also the importance of not just looking at a painting, but actually going beyond it and seeing the elements of that painting. And now I'm going to invite William. Would you please deal with the imperialists?
So what happens to Mughal painting after the death of Alamgir Aurangzeb, when the empire begins to fragment, when the Marathas come raiding up the west coast into central India, when the Jats rise up in the Doab, the Sikhs rise up here in the Punjab, and Delhi is left like this overripe mango surrounded on all sides by warring parties, but it still remains this rich prize in the middle of all this fracturing empire? Well, the traditional answer is not much. Late Mughal painting has always been regarded as hugely inferior to the great days of Akbar, Jahangir, particularly the painting of Shah Jahan's reign. But there is a huge amount out there, and some of it very remarkable. And the story kind of revives again after, towards the end of Aurangzeb's reign, he ends his personal patronage, both of music and of painting, although there is a suspiciously large number of portraits of Aurangzeb for a man who's supposed to have ended painting. It survived under Muhammad Shah Rangila, that many of the court artists have diffused out to Rajasthan, to Kishangarh, up into the hills, which is presumably why Ijaz's favorite artist, Nainsuk, who's probably the artist responsible for this picture, ends up painting a Mughal court scene sitting up in Guler in the Himalayas near Kangra, and maybe borrowing from earlier elephant battles produced in earlier courts. And then the empire fractures further under poor old Shah Alam, seen here at the end of his reign, blinded by Ghulam Qadir, whose blood lives on in great Lahori writers such as Kamala Shamsi, we should add quickly here. Shah Alam takes artists, even when his court collapses and he's exiled out into Patna and Allahabad. He takes artists with him. There is some revival of painting in Delhi as his court comes back to roost in the Red Fort. But it's really under Zafar that you get the proper revival of painting in Delhi. And the reign of Zafar is an extraordinary moment. It's part of what the British call the Golden Calm, which is perhaps a slightly optimistic term for this moment when the company seizes, the East India Company, a multinational company, seizes control of not only the whole of Upper India, but also the Mughal capital of Delhi, and sort of tucks Zafar under its wing as a puppet ruler, hoping to use his name and his prestige to give it authority. And the court artists of the time, particularly the family of Ghulam Ali Khan, who proudly announces in the inscription underneath the scales of justice that he is palace-born. The family which survives in Delhi today claims descent, rightly or wrongly, from Mansoor, the great artist of Jahangir. This is an image of Zafar at his coronation. He's sitting sort of cross-legged on a slightly Europeanized throne, hovering almost in this aura of majesty, slightly disembodied, as much saint and peer as ruler. And Zafar, although he's been shorn of all military and economic power, the great lands that we saw Shah Jahan ruling from the last slides of Mehreen have long vanished. Kashmir has gone, the whole of the Deccan has gone, all that is left really is Delhi or even the Red Fort itself. And yet Zafar reinvents himself as this extraordinary patron of the arts. And he can't afford to build great Mughal buildings like Shah Jahan. There's certainly no Taj Mahals in his reign, only one little pavilion in the Red Fort and the great Zafar gateway of Zafar Mahal in Mehroli. But he does what he can do as a cultural catalyst. And he's a calligrapher and he's a poet, and a poet in 6 languages. And by his example, he creates in Delhi on a very low budget, because one of the great things about writers is they're not very expensive to keep. And one of the reasons why literary festivals are possible. He provides patronage for this extraordinary last great moment of Mughal culture, represented by the poets such as Zauq, and greater by far, Ghalib himself. And so you get this last moment of Mughal patronage with painting, with calligraphy, with poetry, and competing poets, competing in the famous mushairahs. The fictionalized last mushairah of Delhi represents the sort of mushairah which took place very regularly under the auspices of Zafar. And presumably because the court could not afford to keep its atelier going entirely on its own patronage, you find what you would never have found during the reign of Shah Jahan is that imperial artists work moonlight for other local noblemen. So Nawab Judger, seen here riding on his tiger, as one does of a hot Haryana afternoon, he is using the services of Ghulam Ali Khan, the same man who proudly announces he's palace-born in the previous picture. He works also for James Skinner, the half Scottish, half Rajput military commander sitting in Haryana. For Skinner, he paints a whole variety of different books, including this, the Tazkirat al-Umra, which has the different, all the different castes and the different employments of Delhi. And this is Ustad Humat Khan, who was the sort of Keith Richards of the late Mughal court. Despite being blind, such was his prestige that he managed to impregnate one of Zafar's concubines very timely in 1855, and was banished to Hyderabad, which meant he and the Delhi Gharana survived the massacres and near genocide of 1857 to 8. So he did well, shall we say. But the most prolific new patrons, perhaps surprisingly, are the East India Company residents who arrive in Delhi, and you have this strange transformation. Sitting here in this famous picture is Sir David Ochterlony, who you can see dressed in a sort of fancy Rohit Bal wedding outfit, or maybe a Fab India kurta. I can't get Audrey's pointer working here. Is this it? No, I'll give up. Anyway, you can see that he's sitting here surrounded by his dancing girls, a very suitable way of depicting a man who famously had 13 Indian wives, each, according to legend, would circle the Red Fort on an elephant each evening with Ochterlony in the lead. He has a man with a fly whisk behind him, and best of all, he has the outraged Scottish ancestors peering down from the portrait, wondering what's happened to Ur Devi after a few years in Delhi, and well they might have asked, as things were clearly going out of control. One of his staff was this character, William Frazer, shown here, drawn in Edinburgh, painted in Edinburgh, just before he caught ship. Look what happens when he arrives in Calcutta. You've got to watch the facial hair in the next few. He's still got his Scottish hat on, but from the moustache down, he's becoming, as one of his friends said, Brahminized, and those are his calligraphy pens in his hand. He arrives in Delhi, and this is him with Ghalib's cousin, Ahmed Baksh Khan, with whom he started a horse-dealing business. Well, watch his facial hair in the next few. William Frazer commissions a wonderful set of images of the people and places of Delhi. This dancing girl, Pari Khan Kanegi, could still cut quite a dash in House Caste Village or in a Lahore fashion scene today if she turned up wearing this on the Mall. And the Frazer album was commissioned as sort of like a modern artist would take Polaroids, just as information for dresses and skin types and buildings and so on. And the Frazer brothers don't seem to have realized, in a sense, the quality of the artists who were from the family and from the workshop of Ghulam Ali Khan that they were employing. But they are remarkable images. The album turned up in Scotland in the 1980s and was dispersed, sadly, around the place. So we've got a number of them, a whole room gathered together for the first time at the moment in the Wallace Collection, if anyone's in London until mid-April. And these are extraordinary images of ordinary Haryanvi villagers lining up to join Skinner's horse in this particular picture. Again, portraits as accurately done. Each one of these has a number above them, which you can actually refers to the name and details of each of the individual recruits. And so the same loving attention to detail which Mehreen showed in her images at the court scenes of Shah Jahan is now being lavished on ordinary villagers from Haryana lining up to join an irregular cavalry regiment. This world finally comes to a close only in 1857 to 8 at the Great Uprising. And when the East India Company's own sepoys rise up against the company in what is the largest anti-colonial revolt anywhere in the world in the 19th century. They come, although most of them are Hindu, to the Mughal court. And Zafar, somewhat reluctantly at first, agrees to be the figurehead for this uprising. And in the terrible retribution which follows in 1858, with horrible massacres of wholesale massacres of innocent civilians in Delhi, but also Lucknow and Kanpur, this whole world closes. And when Val Prinsep is sent out in the 1870s to paint an image of the princes of India for one of Queen Victoria's sort of Darbar jamborees, he tries to find the painters of Delhi surviving and reports that they are only executing copies of the works of their forebears. The tradition has died. So there is under Zafar this final last flourish, but it's killed dead in 1858. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, William. William has, of course, brought us up to date, and whereas Audrey began with Akbar, and then Mehreen continued it through Jahangir, and finally the conclusion was explained by William. Pandit Nehru once said that he was the last Englishman to rule India. And after this presentation, you'll realize why William is the last Englishman to have conquered India.
Scott, please.
Scott. We don't differentiate, they're all the same from this distance.
All Angres.
Okay. I'm now going to invite a couple of questions with your permission. And one of the questions is, because you've dealt, Audrey, with the identification of artists and as you've done, Mehreen, in which in the famous Darbar picture in the Bachanama, each character, each individual is identified. Modern art historians have begun to veer towards the artist rather than the patron and even the subject matter. You brought out the question of the translations, etc. Why do modern art historians now want to pin a tail on the donkey? Any one of you?
I think Mehreen is better.
I think I think that there is an awareness now that when you look at these paintings, you have to look at the totality of the context of their production. So it's not just about the patron. It's not just about what is being depicted. It's not just about the artist. Because there is this cohesive action which is undertaken, which involves a realm of ideas and people being put together. So when we have the paintings, for example, from Jahangir's court, there's this incredible portrait of a zebra, which he has commissioned for the history of his reign. The zebra is brought to his court because he's heard about this fantastic painted mule, which is being brought through the kingdom. He sees it. He doesn't believe that it is real, so he has people scrubbing it to wash away this paint. And it's only when he realizes and he sees the fact that it can't be washed, he thinks, okay, this is a very unique creature. And he has his artist paint it. So he, as the patron, has seen it, wants it visualized, has the artist do it to be put into the history of his reign. So the subject was unique. The painter who was able to paint it realistically was unique, and it was his desire. So yes, there is this shift in our historical thinking where you are no longer just thinking about what you're looking at, but that's good, because you have to understand the context of something being made.
Willie?
Jahangir was very proud that he was able, he said, to recognize the different hands working on the paintings. And he boasts in his memoirs that he can tell, even if there's several different hands working on a single picture, he can tell who did the hands, who did the arm, who did the faces, and so on. But I think more recently, as Ijaz knows very well, there's been this move particularly since B.N. Goswami, to try and give names to replace what used to be geographical locations for paintings, so Kangra, Guler, and so on, and instead call it Purku or Manak or Nainsook. And B.N. Goswami's famous article, The Family is the Origins of Style, has created a wave in Indian art history to try and pin individuals to certain works. And both the advantages and the disadvantages of that was apparent in the big exhibition that Goswami put on first at the Rietberg in Zurich and then in New York, where various pictures that clearly had multiple hands were occasionally being shoved into a single artist's genre. So while on one hand you were honoring individual artists by giving them identity in the same way that you wouldn't say that Michelangelo's Last Judgment was Roman style or Vatican style. It is Michelangelo commissioned by Julius II for a specific, and you give the artist the due honor. So BNG's attempt to do this and extending it across the whole of art history has been, I think, a major advance. But where you have family workshops or even different hands working, the whole thing slightly breaks down.
In a sense, it's the equivalent of the gharanas in music, where you have the whole family, and it's not just one individual, but a collaborative effort. Audrey, would you like to add?
Yeah, so I guess I would add, I think that a very productive trend in Mughal historiography over the last several decades has been to displace some attention from the central Mughal kings and give it to other people in the Mughal court. And that's obviously a trend that is, sort of always being balanced by our ongoing obsession with the big names, right, with Akbar and Jahangir and Shah Jahan and so forth. But to the extent that identifying individual artists can be a way to see who else was in the Mughal court and some of the diversity in terms of religion and region and ethnicity and these sorts of things, that where people are coming from, I think that it can be healthy. I would add that, if I have a sort of contribution to make on my own to this, it's not so much seeing individual artists, but rather pointing out that the images are almost never just images, right? While you all were looking at the images, I was reading the poetry on them, right? There's always text there as well. And so the images are meant to be understood with the text and vice versa. And again, another sort of trend that's been slower to take off, but I think we are seeing it accelerate in the scholarly world, has been collaborations between sort of straight up historians and art historians. And I think that has been very productive as well.
Good. Somebody has maintained that modern patrons, unlike the Mughals and the Pahari patrons that we've seen, modern patrons have more champagne money and beer tastes. I'm going to ask each one of you that if you had been, and Willie has referred to Julius II, if you had been the equivalent of Julius II and you were commissioning the equivalent of a Michelangelo, which are the individual paintings that would be your particular favorites? Would you like to share them with us on the screen?
So this is our sort of favorite images section. So this is one of my favorite images from Mughal India, and it's from very late Mughal India. I mean, honestly, maybe it's not even from Mughal India. I'm not entirely sure where this was written. But anyways, so in the middle you see the Persian Mahabharata, right? This is the Razamnama that was translated in Akbar's court. But then all around it you see Sanskrit verses from the original Mahabharata. And this manuscript today is held in Srinagar. And I have seen digital images of it in Delhi. Okay, that's where this is coming from. And one thing, so I like several things about this. One is that when I first laid eyes on this manuscript, I was just looking at Razamnamas. I had no idea there would be Sanskrit there as well. And it was the first moment where I realized that somebody other than me had been able to read both languages at some prior point and had actually read the two against one another. But I also like it because it demonstrates a sort of crucial development in the 18th and 19th centuries, which is that when the Razamnama was first when it was first translated, right, and the Razamnama was made in the late 16th century, it was done by the Mughals for a Muslim audience primarily. Sometime in the 18th century, the majority readership seems to shift, and it is mainly Hindus that read the text. Right? Today we think so much in terms of reified religious categories, right? Sanskrit goes with Hindus, Persian Urdu goes with Muslims. We sometimes forget that far more Hindus could read Persian in the 18th and 19th centuries than could read Sanskrit, right? So they actually access their own epic through the Mughal translation, right? The red is simply marking the beginning of a section, right? So this is coming at the very introduction part here.
Yours.
So, this is mine, and I am obsessed with Jahangir, I readily admit that. But the thing is that when you're looking at Mughal painting, there is a very clear shift which occurs when he comes to the throne, and actually even before he comes to the throne, which is why I particularly love this one. As a prince, Prince Salim, before he takes the regnal title Jahangir on becoming the emperor, Salim embarked upon the classic Timurid princely activity of rebelling against his father. So around 1600, he goes to Allahabad, sets up a rival court, starts calling himself Shah Salim, so King Salim, which is effectively treason. And he has his own artists working for him there. And this portrait of Salim at the time was painted in Allahabad. And we know that because it's dated for that time period by one of the artists there. And what is, I think, incredible. So it's dated 1600, 1601, just within a year or two after he starts his rebellion. And it's amazing how aware he is of the potency of visual language, because this is a portrait he has commissioned of himself as a king, although he's still a prince, in Allahabad, while his father is still reigning. It is the most luxurious, powerful imperial image compared to anything that Akbar was ever pictured as. Akbar is the figure in the white at the upper right-hand corner. And when we see portraits of him and paintings of him, it's like this. He's not dressed excessively luxuriously. We don't have the incorporation of jewelry as a key part of Mughal costume by this time. And if you look at the portrait that Jahangir has made, it's just him on the page, on this incredible throne. So he's projecting himself before he's even on the throne as emperor, as a king. And it's this visual expression of power which far, is way and above anything that his father was ever depicted as. And so I think it's one of these key moments in Mughal painting where you see this shift happening.
Yeah, apparent. Indeed. It's a powerful page. I've never seen this before.
Oh, it's
My
wonderful.
compliments.
Wonderful.
Yes,
Amazing.
wonderful. Willie, last, your guy.
So my
favorite?
choice is color, this double portrait of William Frazer's sort of ADC color, who saved his life from a tiger when they were walking in Haryana. And Frazer commissioned 2 images of him. One as color appeared either out of his Haryana village with sort of dirty dhoti and disheveled turban and hair all over the place, or as he had, or maybe with the sword unsheathed as he rescued him from the tiger with only a sword, which is an incredibly dangerous and brave thing to do. And then in the second portrait, you get him in this sort of faux Napoleonic outfit after a kind of blow dry and pedicure and a visit to the Pearl Continental Salon. He's this very elegant figure, same man, same expression, but now he's got a curl to his moustache. He's got the Frazer crest on his crossband with the heart's head, which is the Frazer symbol. And this wonderful sort of you can't see it so clearly in this picture, but it's a kind of Shavite thing going on with his hat. It's a tiger skin with a half moon. What I liked best about this was that Frazer was obsessed with Bonaparte. These days, you know, you tend not to admire your country's natural enemy. Very few people here send love letters to Mr. Modi, for example, or vice versa. Although in the old days, people did send lots of love letters to Imran, but we'll pass over that in a different way. When William Frazer, same time he's commissioning this, discovers that Bonaparte is sitting without any library in St. Helena, he sends his entire Oriental library from Delhi, ships it off in a single grand gesture to St. Helena, where it sinks on the way, and all these Mughal manuscripts he's collecting and everything else never make it to St. Helena. But Napoleon hears that he's made this gesture, and though he has virtually nothing, very few possessions in St. Helena, he sends to Delhi, to this young officer, his signet ring, which had signed all his imperial orders when he was emperor, and a bust of himself by Canova, which somehow unimaginably makes it to Delhi before Frazer's killed in 1835. And then, just to finish off, in 1857, the bust of Napoleon has made it from, after Frazer's death, to Metcalfe House, the property of Sir Thomas Metcalfe. And when Metcalfe House is looted and burnt in 1857, the statue is stolen, and no one knows where it's gone until it turns up 10 years later, being worshipped as an image of Shiva in a Shiva temple. Anyway, that's the final apotheosis of ha-ha Napoleon.
Well, no one can cap that. So may I, because we've reached the end of our, ask you to give an ovation to our panelists, Audrey, Mehreen, and William.
Signing books? Signing books after. Sorry? We're all signing books, I think, after.
Yes,
Yes, of course. Before you end, I'd just like to say that thank you very much for the session. But at 11 o'clock, Orhan Pamuk will be doing a book signing at the bookshops. And please remain orderly. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And as for William and the other authors.